The streets smelled of chip grease and diesel, bin bags piled up outside corner shops as strikes dragged on, and rats darted between puddles of ale and broken glass. A woman lit her last cigarette with a match she pulled from a council gas bill. Somewhere down the road, a bus never came. This wasn't a dystopia. This was home. And this was Britain's biggest cities in the 1970s. Through all the grime and grit, something else pulsed beneath the surface. Life, defiance, and the strange beauty of cities learning to survive themselves. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, and Liverpool weren't polished, but they were unforgettable. If you've ever wondered what these giants of the UK really looked like 50 years ago, don't blink, because here, the past is louder than you think. London in the 1970s was tired. Not just tired from war scars or aging buildings, but from a decade that brought more tension than triumph. The city had grown enormous, but its foundations felt shaky, socially, politically, even architecturally. It was a capital without confidence, uncertain whether it was still leading or just trying to keep up. The skyline began to change. Concrete dominated. Glass and steel structures crept in, but instead of modern beauty, they brought coldness. The old Victorian heart of the city seemed to beat slower, its edges buried under layers of development. In places like Croydon and the South Bank, the future had arrived, but it looked like grey boxes and empty lobbies. Industrial unrest added fuel to the unrest in people's daily lives. The winter of discontent was more than just headlines. It was uncollected rubbish, flickering streetlights, and a constant sense that things were falling apart. Trains stopped, bins overflowed, and power cuts left entire boroughs in darkness. Children did their homework by candlelight, while radios reported the next strike. And yet, the city still pulsed. Theatres stayed open, markets hustled on, and music began to scream louder than the silence of broken systems. Punk exploded from backrooms in Soho and Camden, angry and raw. Immigrant communities brought new flavours, sounds, and celebrations to streets once lined only with fish and chips. London didn't just absorb change, it survived it, reshaped by those who refused to leave. Rain was constant, as if washing the city without ever making it clean. The pavements glistened with oil and puddles, bus exhaust hung in the mist, and pigeons huddled under dripping signage. But for all its grime and gloom, 70s London had a texture, unmistakable, stubborn, and strangely cinematic. It wasn't the London of postcards, it was the London that stayed with you. Even the tube had its own rhythm, grimy, crowded, but unstoppable. From King's Cross to Brixton, it carried workers, dreamers, and loners through tunnels soaked in graffiti and newspaper headlines. Each station told a different story, written in posters, accents, and tired faces. Birmingham in the 1970s looked like the future, but not the kind people hoped for. The city centre was wrapped in concrete, dominated by underpasses, subways, and roundabouts. Planners had tried to modernise fast, but in doing so, they buried much of the Victorian charm under grey slabs. To many, the Bullring looked less like progress and more like a bunker. Factories still ruled the rhythm of life. The hum of machines echoed from Aston to Small Heath, and the skyline bristled with chimneys and cranes. This was a city that worked, sweated, produced. Generations clocked in and out of metalworks, car plants and warehouses. And even as automation crept in, the smell of oil and steel stayed thick in the air. But underneath that surface, cracks were growing. Unemployment began to rise, especially for young people and immigrants. Tensions simmered in neighbourhoods where jobs were disappearing and housing was tight. In Handsworth and Sparkbrook, the streets felt forgotten, busy but neglected. Birmingham was growing, but not for everyone. And still, it moved. Buses screeched through traffic, markets buzzed with stallholders calling out in Punjabi, Urdu and Brummy slang. On Saturday nights, pubs thumped with ska, reggae and glam rock. The city may have looked grey, but its soul was anything but. There was colour in the people, rhythm in the streets, and a defiance that kept everything moving. The concrete never softened, but the people did. Families made homes in tower blocks. Kids played football on estates lined with graffiti and chain-link fencing. Birmingham in the 70s was tough, messy, vital, and very much alive. Even in the shadows of factories, culture kept growing. On paper, on canvas, and on vinyl. The city gave birth to heavy metal and radical poetry alike, carried by kids who'd grown up under smoke and sirens. It wasn't easy, but it was never empty. Manchester in the 1970s was damp, defiant, and determined to stay on its feet. Rain clung to brick walls, and mist rolled in like a second skin. The city still carried the weight of its industrial past. Textile mills stood like sleeping giants, many of them already closed or fading. The economy was shifting, but Manchester's grit remained. Street markets were still the lifeblood of the working class. In places like Smithfield and Gorton, the shouts of traders and the smell of onions, meat and wet cardboard filled the air. Families bought cheap produce, knock-off toys and second-hand coats, while buses groaned past in the fog. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, busy and unfiltered. The factories emptied, but something new filled the space. Music crept out of garages and back rooms, sharp and strange and electric. Before the decade was done, bands like Joy Division and Buzzcocks would put Manchester on the global map. Not for textiles, but for sound. The city didn't collapse, it evolved with reverb. Teenagers wandered through Piccadilly in ripped jeans and army coats, dreaming of escape or revolution, depending on the day. Nightlife grew loud while the days stayed grey, and through it all, the people kept showing up. At the chip shop, the job centre, the record store, Manchester never begged for attention. It made you come to it. Would you still recognise it today? The rain hasn't stopped, but maybe that's the point. In the middle of it all, football never paused. Main Road and Old Trafford filled with chants and roars, the terraces packed despite the weather. For 90 minutes, the city came alive in unity, joy and heartbreak. Glasgow in the 1970s was stone, smoke and survival. Tenement blocks stretched for miles, many crumbling from decades of soot and rain. The shipyards along the Clyde had once roared with industry, but now they sat quiet more often than not. The decline wasn't sudden, but you could feel it in the silence. Council housing projects rose in their place, tall, grey, wind-bitten towers that promised new beginnings and often delivered loneliness. In areas like Easter House and Drumchapel, entire communities were uprooted from the city centre to the outskirts. The lifts broke down, the walls grew damp, and the city's heart felt scattered. People had homes, but not always hope. Still, Glasgow refused to collapse. The people were tough, funny, and fiercely loyal to their streets. The Gorbals might have been demolished, but its memory survived in stories told over pints and fish suppers. Every corner had a tale, every scar a punchline or a warning. Art and politics stirred in the background, theatre thrived, folk songs echoed in pubs, and working class activism found its voice again. Even in the darkest corners there was fire. Children played football in alleyways between peeling walls. Women gathered for tea and laughter, even when money was tight. It wasn't easy, but it was never dull. The buildings cracked, but the spirit didn't. Glasgow in the 70s was hardship made human. And those who lived it, they still carry its accent in their bones. Trains clattered into Queen Street Station, a gateway from struggle to possibility. For many, Glasgow's grit wasn't a burden. It was a badge. They survived together. That was enough. Liverpool in the 1970s felt like a city holding its breath. The docks, once the pride of the empire, had slowed to a crawl. Shipping routes changed, and the jobs disappeared with them. Warehouses stood empty, cranes rusted in place. The Mersey was still there, but its traffic had thinned, and so had the optimism. Yet the music didn't die. After the Beatles, the city kept humming. Folk clubs, reggae nights, punk gigs in smoky backrooms. Young people still picked up guitars, still scribbled lyrics, still believed that sound could rescue them. Music filled the gaps that work had left behind. In places like Toxteth and Kirkby, daily life grew harder. Unemployment soared, and so did frustration. Shops closed, streets emptied. Riots would come before the decade ended, but for now, the anger simmered under the surface. And yet, neighbours still leaned on each other. The laughter never fully disappeared. Anfield roared on match days, reminding the city it could still feel alive. Ferries crossed the water under clouds that never moved, and pensioners fed pigeons like nothing had changed. Liverpool carried a sadness, but also a stubborn glow. It had lost its empire, but not its voice. What would you give to walk it again? Even in decline, Liverpool's identity held firm. It was a city that wore its pain loudly, but also its pride. And that pride, passed down in pubs, parks and porches, never needed translating. They weren't perfect. Far from it. These 5 cities were battered by crisis, dimmed by soot, and strained by change. But they endured. Through strikes and silence, tower blocks and broken windows, people kept showing up. They laughed, they built, they danced. That decade didn't define them, but it carved them deep. The 1970s weren't glamorous, but they were unforgettable. The factories, the fog, the fading shop signs, they all held stories worth remembering. And in those stories, there's a heartbeat that still echoes through the bricks, the songs and the streets. Because if you listen closely, you'll realise these cities never stopped speaking.